Hi everyone, my name is Beth Link and I'm an art educator. I've been an art teacher for a number of years in Denver and in Austin. Right now I'm in a PhD program at UT Austin in cultural studies, in curriculum and instruction. And I have a master's also from UT Austin in art education and communities. And so I'm here today to talk to you about white lies, unraveling whiteness in the elementary art curriculum. And I just want to start out with thanking Flavia for putting together this incredible event and for inviting me to participate. And also just on a personal note, I am 8 months pregnant. So if you notice that I'm a little bit out of breath, that's what's happening. I've got a giant baby compressing my lungs. So with all of that, let's go on and get started. And I'm going to share my screen with y'all. Okay, so, this feels like a really important moment for us to be having these conversations, and a really important event for us to be at together as art educators who are really concerned with taking up these issues critically. We are each responsible for countering white supremacy and violence and legacies of oppression where we can. And as art educators, I do believe that we have a very special set of tools at our disposal to take up these things. And I just want to start off by acknowledging that art educators are not neutral. We are embedded in the daily work of curating knowledge, spinning stories into lesson, taking inspirations from art history. And this entire project is highly subjective, and the weight of our positions as shapers of history is not often taken up in critical ways in our field. And there are many ways that we shape history. Sometimes it's through direct teaching, and other times it's through omissions and silences. Trudeau reminds us that the presences and absences embodied in our sources are neither neutral or natural. They're created. And I think this is important to remember because if our art historical sources are built upon the enduring ills of racial inequity, then we can't be impartial transmitters of a history in our classrooms. We're actually implicated in these systems as we reproduce it, as we retell these stories. And so we should not assume that by saying, oh, I'm not political, or I just don't talk about politics in my classroom, that we're not being political. We're all implicated. And our experiences, our biases, the values of these institutions that we're part of, they work in and through us, sometimes without us even being aware that these are happening. And so who are the art teachers that make up our field? Well, they're 70% white and female. And this is the demographics of our teachers, even as our student population is becoming increasingly more ethnically and racially diverse. And so in the face of this demographic mismatch, it's really important for white art educators specifically to critically reflect on the roles that they have in reproducing these harmful narratives in their classrooms. So this is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. I've been thinking about these questions for quite some time, and I'd like to investigate them here with you today. When thinking about curriculum, especially elementary art curriculum, how are artists of color and white artists, how are they presented in the curriculum? How are their stories told? How are they contextualized? And how does racial logic and whiteness operate through these curriculum documents? And so I'm examining this issue through 3 different case studies to see how whiteness functions in elementary art district curricula across the country. So before I get too deep into the data, I do want to acknowledge my own journey as a white art educator. I've been an elementary art teacher for 7 years in Denver and in Austin. This is me with my incredible students who I love and miss very much from Denver. And one thing that I always really struggle with is I wanted to do right by my students, but I felt unsure of how to do that, right? My district curriculum was very, very vague in both places that I taught. And I noticed that, the curriculum would say things like, teach about African art and use line, shape, and color. And that is such a vague curriculum. It leaves a lot of room for innovation and possibility, as teachers could be doing really progressive, wonderful, creative teaching things within these broad guidelines, but also leaves a lot of room for teachers to do harm, right? And for teachers to do things that maybe are not great for students, right? They're actually harmful. And so I felt very isolated. I was the only teacher in my school that did art education, and I just really didn't know where to turn and how to get better. And so I went back to graduate school, where I'm still researching how white art educators can responsibly teach about cultures other than their own. And I come to this work as a white art educator, and I'm still engaging in a daily process of unraveling my own complicity with these systems of white supremacy, privilege, and oppression that, even as I'm attempting to disrupt them, I'm recognizing that I'm still caught up in them, and we all are. And many of the processes and practices that I'm critiquing here today, I've also participated in as an art teacher. So I just want to acknowledge that at the beginning, that that's important to say in the space. And it is my hope that this research will help myself and other art educators, especially white art educators, to consider the power of our practice and enter into this work critically engaged with the stories that we're telling our students. So one way that the field of art education has kind of tackled this problem of how do we teach culture is through multiculturalism. And the field has taken this up in multiple iterations over the years. It's changed a lot since the 60s and 70s when it was first kind of started up. And it really, over this whole time, it usually focuses on non-white and non-Western artists, leaving whiteness and power completely unexamined. And over time, the label of multicultural became quite diluted. And now what passes for multiculturalism oftentimes is teachers buying multicultural construction paper, using skin tone crayons, and it gives them this false sense that they're practicing multiculturalism without having to actually engage with issues of power, oppression, or reflect on their own identity at all. And vague curriculum documents leave so much space that oftentimes teachers don't know what they should be teaching. And so for inspiration, they'll go to places like Pinterest or teachers' blogs, which can sometimes be, more harmful than good, where they're actually perpetrating many of these things that we're trying to work against in multiculturalism, right? They're actually reifying stereotypes and racial hierarchies rather than dismantling them. And Dr. Acuff, who's our fabulous keynote speaker, who I'm so excited to hear, and other art education scholars have been calling for a new kind of multiculturalism called critical multiculturalism, where it is not just studying about other cultures, but it's also critiquing power dynamics, reflecting on ourselves, and how we relate to others. And so this leaves me with a question. Why should we study curriculum? What can we gain from this work? And why is this important specifically in this moment? Why should we spend our time studying this when there's so much else to study, when the world is frankly upside down? What good is it to look at these documents? And I think Sylvia Wynter said it best when she talked about how the function of the curriculum is to structure what we call consciousness, and therefore certain behaviors and attitudes. So this links what's happening out in our world, in our communities, to what we're taught in schools. And that a lot of these things that are happening are because of these biases, these assumptions, this violence and smog, as Dr. Acuff puts it, that we've internalized, that we've actually been taught in our education system. And so if we want to make change in our world, one way that we can start is by thinking about what we're actually teaching students, especially in these formative years of elementary school. And in this study, I'm looking at 3 different district curriculums, but I'm not trying to really single out any one curriculum as being especially terrible or wonderful. I'm saying that these are kind of barometers that we can see what are the priorities of these larger systems and policymakers, and people dictating what we teach in our classrooms. What are their priorities? What are their values? And once we kind of understand that, we can begin to either reinforce them or challenge them in our own classrooms and spaces. However, these curriculum documents can't really tell us how teachers are enacting these guidelines, right? It's one thing for teachers to get a piece of paper that says teach these things, but we don't really know what teachers are doing with these curriculum documents. It could be that they're very faithfully enacting them word for word, or it could be that they're taking these documents and they're challenging them and they're flipping them on their head and they're countering them in their classroom, and we just don't know. And that's actually what I'm doing my dissertation research on. So it's important to study curriculum because it tells us what could be happening in the classroom and what the priorities of district leaders are. And over time, lots of different scholars have had lots of different taxonomies of what multiculturalism looks like and how could we break it down. Banks has this taxonomy of multiculturalism that maybe y'all are familiar with, where he breaks it down into 4 different approaches. So the first one, just pretty common, is contributions, and it focuses on mainstream heroes and holidays. So in this approach to multiculturalism, you see a lot of teachers studying Dia de los Muertos. You see heroes being studied like MLK that are very mainstream and palatable in the way that they're taught. And in the additive approach, culture is superficially discussed only at select entry points. So this is when you only hear about Black artists or Black inventors or Black authors when it's Black History Month, right? It's only at these specific entry points. Transformative curriculum is when diverse perspectives are kind of woven through the whole year. So it's trying to add them in more often. And it might even shape the course of the curriculum. And then social action is when teachers talk about other cultures, and they may also talk about power and oppression. And this kind of curriculum expands beyond the walls of the classroom out into communities to attack and address social issues. I find De La Cruz's taxonomy of multicultural art products to also be really useful here. She talks about ethnic tourism, where these art products that teachers use to teach may be apolitical or decontextualized. They might have a novel inclusion of exotic cultures. And a lot of times when folks are doing ethnic tourism, they're making replicas, right? Where they're gonna look at this artwork of indigenous totem poles, and they're gonna make one out of toilet paper rolls, right? So they're mimicking. In the second level, design and media literacy, this is very prevalent in our field, a focus on elements and principles of art, and cultural objects are really only discussed in aesthetic terms, right? So we're only talking about Mexican art and artists if we're looking at certain kinds of lines or if they're using hot and cold colors, right? We're not actually engaging with the substance of their work. We're just looking at the surface treatment, the aesthetics, right? Cultural heritage is when there are thematic explorations of other cultures, but it's really just to appreciate and to understand them. It's really not reflecting on our own Western canon or disrupting or questioning our own approach to aesthetics. It's all about just understanding and appreciating and holding at an arm's length. And social issues in this final approach, artwork may actually be disturbing. It may prompt students to ask questions, to take some kind of action, and content is provided so that teachers are able to engage with some of these root causes and these issues of power and oppression. And so in my specific study, what I did is I used a methodology called content analysis, where I took these documents and I looked at them in a couple of different ways. So first I did frequency counts, where I was seeing who are the different artists that they're studying each year, how often are they advised to study them, what are the demographics of these folks. And in this process, I looked not just for the manifest meaning, which is just what's the text, what's on the surface level, but also the latent meaning, like what is implied, what is the deeper under the surface meaning that I can get from these counts. I also looked at how art and artists were organized, right? Are there hierarchies that are starting to be seen? what context they're providing, what vocabulary and goals they suggest for each unit. So all of these things were very important as I went through and did this content analysis. So my data. So each of these districts were chosen because they were publicly available. I got all of these scope and sequence curriculum documents just through online searches. They were detailed enough to list specific artists, artworks, and projects. And they represented 3 very distinct geographical areas of the country. And they also contained significant populations of both white students and students of color. And so, the very first district that I'd like to talk about today is Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is a district that's in driving distance of Philadelphia. And you can see some info about their demographics here. They have an average family income of $40,000, majority white, but also some Black and multiracial students. And their curriculum is really interesting because it's only 6 pages long for the entire thing from kinder all the way through 5th grade, which is quite striking, I think. And each year is guided by a theme, and they list 7 to 10 artists to study every year. And one thing that I find interesting, move this over here, is that there's disparate representation, right? So when you look at who are the artists that they're studying each year and compared to their students, I've kind of broken it down by gender and racial lines. One thing that I find fascinating is that despite having 15% of their students identify as Black or African American, they didn't study a single Black artist in 6 years, which I find interesting and remarkable. And they're also preserving the grand narrative, where although the Williamsport curriculum focuses on these universal themes, there are still designated entry points for white artists, or for artists of color, sorry. And so in all of these different years, they're exclusively studying white artists. So in this year of self-discovery, imagination, inspired by nature, and art and artists from Pennsylvania, it's only white folks. And so this suggests not only are white artists more worthy of study, but also, in years like in 4th grade, artists from Pennsylvania, the only artists to come out of Pennsylvania that are worthy of study are white artists. And what does this say to students of color who are living in Pennsylvania right now? And so you also notice that there are set entry points for artists of color. So they only enter into the curriculum in 2nd grade's unit on cultural and community diversity, and 5th grade, art through the ages. So these are units with themes explicitly on diversity. So in 5th grade historical unit, Egypt is the only non-white culture that they instruct teachers to study. And the stated goal here is to, quote, explore all civilizations throughout time. So the omission of non-white civilizations implies a value judgment about whose cultures contribute to the progress of civilization as we know it. And by depicting the advancement of history as led by white cultures, it's really marginalizing non-white artists and equating the story of human progress with the story of whiteness. And the third thing that I found was that whiteness in Williamsport is the norm. And you see this in the 2nd grade unit on cultural and community diversity, which has the goal of students will discover how art is influenced by cultural differences. But in this year, you have only 3 artists that are studied. These first 2, y'all may be familiar with, 2 artists of color, and then Betty LeDuc, who's a white artist who exclusively paints bodies of color, people of color. She doesn't ever paint about white folks. And so I find this very fascinating, which it marks non-whites as different by segregating them into this one year. And it also really has an implication that culture is possessed exclusively by non-white communities, leaving whiteness to exist outside of a marked cultural space. So Betty LeDuc isn't thinking about white culture. She's not thinking about her own positionality. She's thinking about the culture of others, because only people of color have culture worth painting and worth studying about, leaving whiteness completely unexamined. And so the strength of this curriculum in Williamsport is its desire to investigate larger themes. However, in investigating these topics, they're actually upholding racial divisions and treating students as ethnic tourists, right? Positioning them as anthropologists, where they're holding these other artists and art forms at a distance and locating culture outside of white bodies, using whiteness again to represent the unmarked normative body against which deviations can be measured. So the second district is Granite, Utah. And you can take a look at their demographics while I take a sip of tea. And in Granite, again, you see most of the students are white, with a quarter being Hispanic or Latino. And their curriculum is quite different than Williamsport. We see that it's 24 pages long, and they have an emphasis, instead of on themes, they really don't mention themes hardly at all. They emphasize elements and principles of design. And in fact, they're guided by the same 4 elements and principles of design every single year. So every year they study line, shape, color, texture. Line, shape, color, texture. Every year at varying depths. And again, through doing these frequency counts, I did find that there is disparate representation. So this is especially striking when you look at, they're only teaching 1 female artist out of 33 artists. And even though they have 25% of their student population is Latino or Hispanic, they're not teaching a single Latino artist. And you're also seeing themes of cultural consumption, which is a term that comes from De La Cruz. And here they're in 3rd grade, they have a lesson on Indigenous art where their goal is to create personal petroglyphs using charcoal or chalk on flat rocks to make a pinch or slab pot out of clay and use Native American designs to decorate. And even though the curriculum suggests books about how to contextualize Indigenous art, over the course of these 6 years, the curriculum never advises that students learn the name of any Indigenous tribes or artists. And projects during this unit suggest that students create these personal petroglyphs, which really exoticizes and trivializes Indigenous culture, turning Indigenous art into anthropological curiosities that are easily possessed by white young artists and are easily mimicked. And, this feeds into my other finding about preserving racial hierarchies. So Granite depicts Native American culture as primitive, antiquated, easy to mimic, and removes them from the vital contemporary concerns of Indigenous artists today. There's a lot of Indigenous artists who are working right now whose work may not look exactly like this, and they're commenting on things that are relevant in our contemporary society, but those are not studied in Granite. Rather, the only contemporary or modern artists that are studied are white. And this sets up a dichotomy as they study white artists over the course of many centuries who grow, progress, invent, are really pushing the boundaries into the 21st century, and they're innovative. And this is contrasting with the stagnant, antiquated, and primitive portrayals of Indigenous artists. And so in Granite, despite attempts to add cultural context, Granite curriculum still devalues the spiritual meaning of these sacred objects by having students mimic them, and still upholds these racial hierarchies. And so this brings me to my 3rd and final district, Spring Valley, Florida. And this is a pseudonym. And in Spring Valley, it's a coastal city with an aging upper and middle class population where, again, it's mostly white folks, but then also some Hispanic and Latino and Black folks as well. And one thing, oops, I forgot about the curriculum, sorry, y'all. And the curriculum here is markedly different from the other 2 districts. So it's 61 pages for every single grade. So it's almost 400 pages for the entire 6 years. And the focus here is a little bit more balanced than the other two. It has the elements and principles, but it pairs them with suggested artists. And each artist that it suggests, that it really highlights, it talks about the racial and gender and ethnic identity of each artist, and also associated art movements. So this is a much more in-depth curriculum document. And so a couple of findings here are that they are making strides to attend to racial diversity. You can see that here. That even though it's not, an exact attention to trying to have as many artists that match their student demographics, they are improving, I guess, compared to the other districts. But we see the disparity when we look at how they contextualize these artists. So I found this very fascinating that, white artists like Kandinsky and Paul Klee, they give their cultural context. So for Kandinsky, they say he was Russian, he was part of these 3 art movements. For Klee, they get very specific and say he's born in Germany, but then he's actually Swiss. He's part of these 5 art movements. So hyper contextualizing these folks. And artists like Tiffany, they're giving not only country of origin, but also city. And then again, art movements, all of these are white male artists. And then you see some disparity when you start to see artists of color. And here we have Japanese artist Hokusai, who's just identified as Asian. Not even a country, let alone a city. Very not specific, very decontextualized from his actual cultural context. With Jacob Lawrence, we see this again also, as he's just listed as African American for his cultural context, where his race is used as a stand-in for his cultural and community identity. And they're really omitting place-specific ties to regions and artistic movements. Like, why isn't New York and Harlem mentioned here, right? For his art movement, they don't mention the Harlem Renaissance. And this is significant, especially because Jacob Lawrence is their most highlighted artist. He's talked about 9 times over the course of these 6 years. So here, whiteness is not made visible. White artists are never named as white, leading again to whiteness being the unmarked humanity. And we see these very shallow inclusions. So here you see the 3 different districts and their most suggested artists that they suggest over time. And here you see Jacob Lawrence suggested 9 times, far more than anyone else. But what does it mean for Jacob Lawrence to be the most talked about artist in Spring Valley, but for the Harlem Renaissance to be omitted from his story? Does this reflect an authentic inclusion of his work, or just a token surface level insertion? And in the Spring Valley curriculum, non-dominant artists are much more likely to lack anchors to specific art movements. That includes women and artists of color. And this disparity is striking because it shows that even when non-dominant artists are included in the curriculum, they still may be decontextualized and stripped of their ties to their community and to where they fit into this grand narrative of our history. And the strength of Spring Valley's curriculum is in its clear appreciation for art history. Like, it's clear that they're passionate about art history, and they really have a lot of recommendations and a lot to say. However, by only providing these very shallow, decontextualized engagement with art history, it really sends a message that the social cultural issues that are underpinning these artists' work are not important to study. And so they're appreciating these folks as cultural artifacts without really reflecting on their own identity and privilege in relation to these different artists. So when looking at all 3 of these districts all together, I'm seeing a couple of themes that I'd like to just touch on. So the first one is this idea of shallow inclusions. So we see that each district includes artists of color only in shallow ways that don't really reveal or disrupt power dynamics. They're not engaging with social cultural issues or issues of identity or power or privilege at all, right? They're only including artists of color in decontextualized ways without links to community or to important concepts. There's no critique of power and oppression. It's all very apolitical. And there's really no attention to whiteness. Culture and race are located outside of white bodies, leaving students without having to reflect on their own identity if they're white students. We also see that whiteness is linked with progress, and we see this especially in Granite and Williamsport, where they have minimal artists of color compared to this robust narrative of white artists, where they're studying white artists in Greece and Rome and medieval artists and Renaissance, modern, American artists, contemporary artists, all white, and they're only seeing artists of color come in at these select entry points where they're usually unnamed and they're studied in antiquity, right? So in this lineage of great white artists becomes the norm, and it sets up this dichotomy that positions artists of color as stuck in the past. Because when students in Granite are learning about Indigenous art, they're not learning about contemporary Indigenous artists. They are learning about ancient petroglyphs, right? Something not connected to current struggles and identities of Indigenous artists. When students in Williamsport are studying Egypt, they're not learning about contemporary Egypt or even modern Egyptian art. They're learning about ancient Egypt. And while these ancient periods and places are very important and should be studied, they should not represent the majority of non-white, non-Western artists that are studied, because it creates a stagnant view that really contrasts with the vibrant, relevant work of the white artists that they highlight. And I think that this is harmful not just for students of color who are not learning about their history and their role in this progress, but also for white students who are learning this very fabricated view of white supremacy through these narratives. And we also see that there's an inclusion of artists of color only at these set entry points. So they're often included, artists of color are often included only in lessons that affirm their status as others, right? So they'll be included in folk art, ancient art, crafts, cultural celebrations, while white artists really are dominating modern, fine, and contemporary art. And these are especially in Williamsport and Granite, but it's also seen in Spring Valley, where we see that artists of color are decontextualized and they're untethered from this canon of art history, while at the same time hyper-contextualizing white male artists. And they're excluding artists of color without explicit links to their community and context, and fail to address the root causes that often are at the heart of these folks' artwork that make race and racism an issue that only concerns people of color and prevents white students from recognizing their own bodies as race subjects. So, with this rather disheartening discussion, how could we teach culture differently in the classroom? What might that look like? And I take heart and take inspiration from Kevin Kumashiro, whose article Towards a Theory of Anti-Oppressive Education really talks about how we can use disruptive knowledge, this knowledge that disrupts our assumptions and makes us rethink our schemas that are organizing our whole identity and all of the things we think we know, how by including this disruptive knowledge, we can instigate crises for students where they become unstuck from what they thought they knew as they confront their biases and try to reconfigure their paradigms. And I do believe that art educators have a unique responsibility to take up this work. Dewey reminds us that the function of art has always been to break through the crust of conventionalized and routine consciousness. So art has this tremendous power to break through and open up space and really make us see what other things could be possible, which is revolutionary in the school system. Bell Hooks reminds us also that art is necessarily a terrain of defamiliarization, which can nurture the spirit and provide ways of rethinking and healing psychic wounds inflicted by assault from the forces of imperialist, racist, and sexist domination. So here we see that not only can visual art disrupt and deconstruct our assumptions, but it also can help us heal and rebuild. And so this twin destructive and creative power in the arts is really unique and puts us in a great position to do this work. And so I think that there are 3 strands of anti-oppressive art education that can help us come up with, starting to sketch out a roadmap for what this might actually look like in our classrooms, communities, and museums. And I think it starts with counter stories, disruptive knowledge, and reflexivity. So I'd first like to talk briefly about counter stories. So counter stories reveal the cracks in the master narrative. And master narratives are the stories that were told in history books, pop culture, by politicians that legitimize and justify power dynamics and the status quo. And counter stories take these master narratives and flip them upside down. And they really challenge the legitimacy through juxtapositions and speaking back to these narratives. One of the best examples I can think of is this fantastic installation by Fred Wilson called Mining the Museum, where he went into a museum collection and scrambled and juxtaposed all of these objects that are upholding master narratives of white progress, white civility, and what happens when you look at this beautiful glass case of this fine metalwork, where normally if you just saw these vases and chalices, you would just think, oh wow, they're so beautiful, what craftsmanship, how refined. But what happens when you add a pair of slave shackles into the center of this work? How does that cause a dissonance in the way that you interpret these objects that makes you rethink the whole master narrative, these objects in the first place, all of museums? It really causes you to question. And so this is why this is such a powerful act. And artists like Kende Wiley and Guerrilla Girls also do beautiful jobs of this. Now, this might look in the curriculum like Williamsport. So if you have this artwork by Betty LeDuc, these smiling Black field workers toiling in the field with their babies on their back, how might you introduce a counter narrative to really open up a dialogue about this? Again, this is by white artist Betty LeDuc. And if you countered it with Esther Hernandez's Sun Mad or Sun Raid series, that is really questioning the whole glowing loveliness of this fieldwork and really starting up conversations about identity, class exploitation, and labor rights. How might this introduce new dialogues and new possibilities? So you still are teaching what's in the curriculum, but you're challenging it, you're upending it. And the second strand is disruptive knowledge. And I think it goes with counter stories. And here, we can build on counter stories through introducing this disruptive knowledge that makes us question what we're told. So I like to think of this as a moment where the record skips, where everything's going along smoothly, and then there's a teachable moment, and teachers can take that opportunity to really start dialogues in that moment, in that space of unknowability and unpredictability. And that's kind of scary, right? Because in these moments of crisis, where all of a sudden something unexpected happens, it's scary for teachers because, as Britzman reminds us, we're taught to equate learning with control and to treat any condition of uncertainty as a threat. And so how can we do this in our classrooms? And I think it starts in, if we want to move towards a curriculum that has disruptive knowledge, it needs to start in our pre-service programs as we're training teachers. What do you do if you encounter a flashpoint where you feel uncomfortable? And it's our instinct as humans to back away, to not move towards those moments. But what if we embedded that into our pre-service programs, where we modeled and actively showed how there's possibility in that space of unknowability? And I think that equipping teachers to have conversations that are uncomfortable, where they're vulnerable, where they don't know the answers, is going to be key towards taking up this work in our classrooms. And that brings me to strand number 3, reflexivity. So I think that embracing an anti-oppressive art curriculum also involves vulnerability and reflexivity for teachers, and especially white teachers. As we're learning alongside our students, we're challenging oppression and inequality and inequity, and we're using the arts to buffer these conversations, because it's a lot easier for students to talk about racism, sexism, homophobia if it's in an artwork and they're not implicated yet. As a first step, talking about it with a little bit of distance, I think, is helpful because it provides a buffer. And then, if you have a good teacher in the room, they can lead you towards thinking about how you might be complicit, how that might relate to your own life, your own identity, and your own work. And that means that we need to be comfortable with using art to provoke these conversations, to buffer these conversations, and to really be reflective. And this is going to require white art educators to start the work or continue the work of unraveling our own complicity in these systems of oppression. And this is going to be a continuous process of learning, educating ourselves, and unlearning also. And we should model this for our students, right? Wouldn't that be so powerful if we modeled this process of unlearning? And we extended this grace and vulnerability and reflexivity to our students as we also consider their needs and perspectives. And this approach might require a whole new vocabulary, a whole rethinking of our profession, because it's not going to be found in elements and principles. It's not going to be found in studies of pure aesthetics. It's going to take a different approach and might need a whole new vocabulary. So I want to leave y'all with a few resources that I found really helpful in thinking about art and thinking about whiteness. So Desai, Hamlin, and Matson have this amazing book, History as Art, Art as History, that uses historical primary texts and contemporary art to really start these difficult dialogues in your classrooms. And Art 21, which you may be familiar with, it's very popular, is a PBS documentary series that has short snippets on different artists, contemporary artists, who are taking up different thematic considerations in innovative and interesting ways. If you're interested in learning more about whiteness, I do recommend this podcast, Seen on Radio. I think season 2 is The Story of Whiteness, and they really trace the construction of white supremacy and how it has evolved and shaped our society, our politics, our identity, our everything over time. I also recommend, if you're working with pre-service teachers or student teachers, new teachers, Revealing the Invisible is in Ethnography by Sherry Marks, where she works with these teachers and really works with them to confront the ways that passive or disconscious racism is working in and through them, even as they have good intentions and they're trying their best. So, in conclusion, I want to say curricula upholding racial hierarchies must be rewritten, and it needs to critically address the narratives that they're reproducing. And until these revisions occur, art educators need to consider ways to augment the context, juxtapose it with counter stories, and consider ways that we can teach what the curriculum is lacking. And teachers have agency to navigate in the space between written curriculum and then what it's actually taught. That's a space of possibility that we have a lot of power to act in. And it's up to each of us to decide how we can unravel the systems of white lies that we're caught up in. As individual teachers, district leaders, policymakers, curriculum developers, museum educators, wherever we find ourselves, we're all accountable to disrupt white supremacy where we can. And it's not enough for our curricula to include diverse artists. We need to develop a curricula that's actively anti-racist. And although we can't shield our students from a world built on inequity and violence, we can provide them with some of the tools to disrupt, to challenge, and to unravel it in their own hearts and minds. So thank you very much for listening to my talk today. I'm happy to talk more with anybody about it. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm going to flash my references up on the screen. You can pause it if you're interested in finding out more about some of the stuff I'm reading and thinking about. And I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the conference and stay safe and take care of yourselves. And I appreciate you all listening to me today. Thank you.